Good evening from Bondi Beach. As the sun was setting on Sunday, two gunmen, a father and son, opened fire as families gathered to celebrate the Jewish Festival of Lights.
On a warm December evening, on one of the most famous beaches in the world, families gathered to celebrate Hanukkah. Children, parents, music, light. Minutes later, gunfire echoed across Bondi Beach. 16 people were killed. 43 were wounded, a child among the dead. Australia, the country that believed strict gun laws, distance, and stability made this impossible, was forced to confront its deadliest terrorist attack in history. This wasn't random violence. This wasn't a failure of policing. It was an ideological attack carried out in a society built on trust. And once trust breaks, everything changes. For decades, Australia believed it had figured something out that the rest of the West hadn't. A way to stay open without losing control. A way to remain peaceful without becoming fragile. Distance from the world's conflicts, strict gun laws, strong borders, high trust in institutions. All the ingredients that were supposed to make large-scale violence unthinkable, and for a long time, that belief felt justified. Australia wasn't Europe. It didn't have centuries of religious wars. It wasn't the crossroads of empires. It wasn't shaped by mass migration waves it never chose. It was a country that selected who entered, how they entered, and under what conditions they stayed. Immigration wasn't accidental, it was designed. That sense of control became part of the national identity. Australians trusted that if something went wrong, the system would catch it. That if someone was dangerous, they wouldn't slip through. That public spaces were neutral ground. Beaches, parks, festivals, places where people gathered without fear. Bondi Beach represented all of that. Not just a tourist destination, but a symbol. A place associated with normal life, sunlight, families, routine. The kind of place where security feels unnecessary because danger feels distant. That's why what happened there didn't just shock Australia. It shattered an assumption. On December 14th, 2025, during a Hanukkah celebration attended by nearly 1,000 people, two gunmen opened fire from a pedestrian bridge overlooking Archer Park. Within minutes, 16 people were dead, a child among them. Dozens more were injured. It was declared a terrorist attack, the deadliest in Australian history. This wasn't a crime hidden in the shadows. It wasn't an isolated incident in a remote area. It happened in one of the most visible, open, and trusted public spaces in the country. And that's what made it different, because Australia had always believed that its model worked precisely because it didn't rely on fear. After the Port Arthur massacre in 1996, Australia radically reshaped its relationship with weapons. Firearms were restricted. Ownership was tightly regulated. The country became an international example of how policy could reduce mass shootings. And for years it worked. Large-scale gun violence became rare. The narrative solidified. Australia had solved this problem. But Bondi exposed something deeper. This attack didn't happen because Australia lacked laws. It didn't happen because police weren't present. It didn't happen because the state ignored warning signs out of negligence. It happened because ideology doesn't respect geography. The attackers weren't strangers who crossed a border the night before. One was born in Australia. The other had lived there for decades. One was known to intelligence services for extremist links years earlier. They didn't act out of desperation or chaos. They acted with intent, with symbolism, with a target. And that reality forces an uncomfortable question that Australia had largely avoided. What happens when the threats a country faces are no longer external, but internal? When danger doesn't arrive by boat or plane, but grows quietly inside a society built on trust? Australia's system was designed around control, points-based migration, language requirements, background checks, offshore processing, clear rules about who stays and who doesn't. It was meant to prevent disorder by filtering risk at the border. But modern extremism doesn't always announce itself at the border. It moves through networks, ideas, and identities that don't disappear once someone receives a visa or a passport. It doesn't need numbers. It doesn't need mass support. It only needs a small number of people who believe that violence is justified, that coexistence is a lie, and that symbolism matters more than life. That's what made Bondi so powerful as a target. Not because it was Jewish, not because it was a holiday, but because it was public, open, and unprotected. An attack not just on people, but on the idea that public life is safe. And when that idea breaks, societies change. Australia is a high-trust society. People generally follow rules not because they're enforced at every moment, but because they're accepted. Authority doesn't rely on constant pressure, it relies on legitimacy. When legitimacy is shaken, the entire system feels more fragile. This is why the reaction wasn't just grief, but disbelief. A collective sense that something fundamental had shifted, that the country had entered a phase it thought it would never face. Because Australia has watched this story unfold elsewhere. In Europe, terror attacks didn't just cause deaths. They changed how people lived. Armed patrols became normal. Concrete barriers appeared in city centers. Public events became fortified. Trust eroded slowly, then suddenly. And once those changes set in, they never fully reversed. Australia had observed that from a distance, as something tragic but foreign, a consequence of historical complexity, mass migration, and political failure elsewhere. Not something that applied here. Bondi erased that distance. What makes this moment especially destabilizing is that it challenges a core belief, that good systems automatically produce safety. Australia did many things right, but systems alone can't neutralize ideology. Laws can restrict tools, but they can't erase belief. Borders can regulate movement, but they can't fully block global conflicts from entering domestic life. And that's the tension Australia now faces. How do you preserve openness when openness becomes a vulnerability? How do you maintain trust when the assumptions behind it no longer hold? How do you protect public life without transforming it into something hardened and fearful? These aren't questions with easy answers, and they aren't unique to Australia anymore. What Bondi revealed wasn't just a security failure or a tragic anomaly. It revealed that Australia is no longer watching the global conflict from the sidelines. It is inside it, whether it wants to be or not. And once that realization sets in, the conversation changes. Not just about policing or laws, but about identity, integration, and what kind of society Australia wants to be in a world where distance no longer protects anyone. This is where the real story begins. To understand why the Bondi attack felt like a turning point, you have to understand how Australia thinks about immigration. Unlike most Western countries, Australia never framed migration as a moral obligation or a historical debt. It framed it as a tool. Migration existed to serve the stability of the country, not to redefine it. For decades, the system was built around selection, points for skills, language requirements, health checks, character assessments, temporary visas tied to work or study. Citizenship is a process, not an automatic outcome. The message was clear, even if it was rarely said out loud. You could come, but you were expected to adapt. That model gave Australians a sense of confidence. Migration was high, but it felt controlled. Diverse, but orderly. The country became one of the most multicultural in the world without experiencing the kind of constant unrest seen elsewhere. Different backgrounds existed, but they were absorbed into a common civic culture. At least that was the perception, and for a long time, it largely held. But over the last 2 decades, something began to change. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly. Temporary migration expanded faster than permanent migration. International students became one of the largest inflows. Work visas multiplied. Humanitarian intakes increased during global crises. The system grew more complex, more layered, and harder to monitor as a whole. At the same time, the world outside Australia changed. Conflicts in the Middle East didn't stay regional. They became globalized through social media, transnational networks, and ideological movements that no longer needed territory to spread. Extremism stopped looking like organized armies and started looking like individuals radicalized online, inside Western societies themselves. This is where Australia's confidence ran into a blind spot. The system was designed to manage entry. It was less prepared to manage what happens after. Integration was often assumed to be automatic. That living in Australia, benefiting from stability and opportunity, would naturally dilute radical ideas over time. That exposure to democratic life would soften extremes. But ideology doesn't always erode with comfort. In some cases, it hardens, especially when people feel disconnected, alienated, or caught between identities. When global grievances are reinforced daily through digital spaces that reward outrage, victimhood, and absolutism. When conflicts thousands of kilometers away are framed as personal battles that must be fought everywhere. The Bondi attackers didn't act because Australia failed economically. They didn't act because of poverty or exclusion in the traditional sense. They acted because they believed they were part of a global struggle that overrode national loyalty, civic responsibility, and even basic humanity. That's what makes this kind of threat so difficult to confront. It doesn't announce itself through mass movements. It doesn't require large numbers. It doesn't always leave obvious warning signs. One of the attackers had been known to intelligence services years earlier. Not enough to intervene, not enough to justify action. And in a society governed by law, suspicion alone is never enough. Australia trusted that balance. The balance between rights and security, between vigilance and restraint, between freedom and prevention. Bondi tested that balance. The fact that one attacker was Australian-born matters, not because of blame, but because it dismantles a comforting narrative. This wasn't about people arriving yesterday. It wasn't about border failure in the conventional sense. It was about something that developed inside the country, under the radar, in a system that assumed time and exposure would solve the problem. This is where Australia begins to resemble places it once viewed as warnings rather than mirrors. Europe learned this lesson the hard way. Attacks carried out by citizens, not recent arrivals. Individuals radicalized locally, not imported fully formed. Second-generation identities caught between worlds, sometimes embracing the most extreme interpretations as a form of certainty in an uncertain life. Australia believed its distance and selectivity would prevent that pattern from repeating, and statistically, it delayed it. But delay is not prevention. What Bondi showed is that even societies with strong institutions can underestimate the power of ideology when it intersects with identity and grievance. And when that happens, the reaction is never just about security. It becomes cultural, psychological, existential. After the attack, the immediate response focused on gun laws, policing, and intelligence failures. That was expected. Those are tangible levers, but beneath that, a quieter conversation began. One that's harder to manage. What does integration actually mean? Is it enough to follow the law, or does it require shared values? Can a society remain open if some within it reject the legitimacy of the society itself? And how much tolerance can a democracy afford before tolerance becomes vulnerability? These questions are uncomfortable because they don't have clean answers, and because asking them risks being misunderstood. For years, many Western countries avoided this discussion entirely, afraid that even acknowledging the problem would fracture social cohesion. But ignoring the question doesn't make it disappear. It only delays it until an event forces it into the open. Bondi was such an event. Australia is not collapsing. It is not descending into chaos. But it is entering a phase of reckoning that other countries entered earlier. A phase where the assumptions that once held society together are no longer taken for granted. The challenge now isn't to abandon openness or to retreat into fear. It's to decide whether openness can survive without a clear boundary of shared norms, whether trust can exist without mutual responsibility, and whether a society can defend itself without losing the values it claims to protect. In the next part, we'll look at what happens after that realization, how societies respond when trust is shaken, why some harden, others fragment, and a few attempt to rebuild something new before it's too late. When societies reach this point, the danger isn't panic, it's denial. The instinct to treat an event like Bondi as an isolated anomaly rather than a signal. To focus on procedures instead of patterns. To believe that tightening one law or replacing one official will restore a sense of normality. But normality doesn't return automatically once it's broken. Australia now stands at the same crossroads other Western societies have faced after moments like this. One path leads toward overcorrection, permanent emergency measures, armed patrols as a fixture of daily life, public spaces redesigned around fear, trust replaced by surveillance, safety achieved at the cost of openness. The other path leads toward fragmentation, where difficult questions remain unanswered, where responsibility is avoided, where cultural and ideological tensions are managed through silence instead of clarity, where parallel realities coexist, each convinced the other is the problem. Neither path is inevitable, but choosing a third requires honesty. Bondi exposed something that statistics alone never could. That security isn't just about laws, borders, or resources. It's about cohesion, about whether the people living inside a society recognize the legitimacy of that society, whether they see themselves as part of a shared future or as participants in a global struggle that overrides national life. This is where integration stops being a policy word and becomes a civilizational one. Integration doesn't mean sameness. It doesn't mean erasing background, belief, or identity, but it does require a minimum agreement on what is non-negotiable. that violence in the name of ideology is never justified, that public life belongs to everyone equally, that loyalty to abstract causes can never supersede the basic right of others to live without fear. Australia has long believed that fairness and opportunity were enough to guarantee that agreement. In most cases, they were, but Bondi shows that fairness alone cannot neutralize extremist belief. That democracy requires defense, not just tolerance. The most dangerous assumption a society can make is that the values it lives by are self-sustaining. History shows they aren't. They must be taught, defended, and sometimes enforced, especially when competing worldviews reject the idea of coexistence itself. This doesn't mean Australia must abandon what made it work. It means it must be clearer about what it expects in return. Rights come with obligations. Freedom comes with limits. Openness comes with responsibility. Other countries learned this lesson too late. Some reacted by hardening everything, others by doing nothing. Both paid a price. Australia still has a choice. Bondi will be remembered not just for the lives lost, but for the question it forced into the open. Whether a society built on trust can adapt to a world where trust is no longer guaranteed. Whether it can confront uncomfortable truths without tearing itself apart. And whether it can protect public life without surrendering it to fear. The answer isn't written yet, but the moment has arrived. If you want to understand how these questions are reshaping countries around the world, from Europe to the UK, from Poland to Australia, make sure to subscribe. And if this video helped you see the bigger picture behind the headlines, watch the next one.